In his now second bombastic appearance, famous Democratic strategist James Carville is warning of the end of days for Democrats. This dude is in a full-on panic, and I can only assume Bernie Sanders supporters are gloating and laughing how the establishment is in panic mode over his exponential rise. I think it's fair to say all the polls have been wrong going back to 2016. We now know all the polls are wrong now. They said Joe Biden was the front runner, and for some reason, strangely, as soon as Bernie wins the popular vote in Iowa, now all the polls start flipping. I find that all highly suspect, but there still is some serious bad news for the Democratic establishment. A new poll from the UK talks about the resounding defeat of the left. Many of you may not be aware that the left in the UK had their worst defeat since 1935. Some areas of the UK had not voted conservative since like 1929 and flipped conservative over the party, their leader, and the weird fringe ideology that seems to be infecting them. And now we can see it. James Carville says, quote, "I'm not interested in being in a cult," and actually points to Jeremy Corbyn in the UK and the resounding failures of the left there, predicting what comes next. Dare I say, the end of days for the Democratic Party. I love how everything is so bombastic. And I love how this is like the 800 millionth video I've done about Democrats in sheer panic. But even Van Jones is saying this. It's just not stopping. The news is getting better and better for Trump. And even the Washington Post can't seem to decide if things are truly getting bad. But let me just add one more thing before we truly dive into the end of days for Democrats. Voter turnout in 2016 for the Democrats was not that good. For Republicans, it was very good. And Democrats are on track for the same voter turnout. So now we're hearing the murmuring of potential panic today as we are awaiting the results of the New Hampshire primary. Many of you may watch this after the primary results have already come in. Maybe it was good news for Democrats. I just don't know. But for now, people are biting their nails and sweating bullets because if Democrats don't turn out in New Hampshire, you may as well just spell the end of days, as James Carville said. Let's read what he did, about what he did say before we get started. Head over to timcast.com/donate if you'd like to support my work. There's several different ways you can give: a PayPal option, a crypto option, a physical address. The best thing you can do, however, is just share this video. I hope, and I say this all the time, that by sharing the video, we can crack some echo chambers open and someone might be exposed to information they did not see before. I can't really count on that because at this point, the competition is so fierce and the rhetoric is so insanely bombastic. I'm just not convinced anyone wants to hear anything other than sweet nothings whispered into their ears. But we do have people like James Carville, long-standing and famous Democratic strategist, struggling to help the center stay on course. And I say center, even though it's kind of weird. He doesn't say he's a centrist. He's talking about liberals. He's talking about the liberals of the Democratic Party fighting with the crazy far leftists. I got some bad news based on the polls from the UK. It looks like Bernie Sanders, at least in my opinion, is on track to lead the Democrats to a resounding defeat, same as we saw in the UK. Let me just make one thing clear. Brexit was voted for. That was the populist movement before Trump. And no one thought it could happen. Everyone said Trump would lose, and Trump won. A populist victory for the right again in the US. If I was a betting man, I'd say what we saw in the UK will be replicated here. You've been warned. Heed James Carville's warnings. He's a strategist. Let's read him. James Carville warns of end of days if Democrats choose Bernie. Quote, "I'm not interested in being in a cult." James Carville, a political strategist and former top advisor to President Bill Clinton, sounded the alarm Monday about the prospect of Senator Bernie Sanders winning the Democratic Party's presidential nomination, calling such a choice the end of days for the party. Appearing on MSNBC's Morning Joe, Carville said the Democrats must defeat President Trump in November or the country will be in an abyss. But he said many of the candidates, Sanders in particular, are not appealing enough of the electorate, including African Americans. Carville likened Sanders to Jeremy Corbyn, the left-wing leader of Britain's Labour Party, who was soundly defeated in December. And I think Fox News didn't go far enough when they said soundly. They should have said crushingly, horrifically, terrifyingly. It was apocalyptic. It was a defeat we had not seen in nearly 100 years. That's how bad it was. And if that track stays true for the U.S. as well, and we tend to follow suit in some ways, man, I got to say, bad news is coming. Here's a quote. The only thing between the United States and the abyss is the Democratic Party. That's it. If we go the way of the British Labour Party, if we nominate Jeremy Corbyn, it's going to be the end of days. So I am scared to death. I really am. I'm going to stop right here. And I'm going to try and end the Bernie. I'm going to call out the Bernie derangement syndrome. Look, I've got some issues with Bernie Sanders, absolutely with the woke ideological left. I do not think Bernie Sanders is literally the end of days for the Democratic Party. Y'all need to calm down. The same rhetoric they have for Donald Trump and everything he's doing, just calm yourself. Now, I happen to think Bernie is a bit out there. I was a bigger fan of him back in 2015, but his rhetoric has absolutely flip-flopped, and we will get to this. I have some data here, and we'll get to that. But the point is, I think we're going to be okay. Like, if Bernie Sanders wins, we're not all going to go up in flames. Like, calm down, everybody. But naturally, the establishment is in full-on panic mode. You see, when Donald Trump ran in 2016, he defeated the Republican establishment. Why? Well, they didn't cheat. The Democrats in 2016 said, we're not making that mistake, and they cheated. They might cheat again. But in all seriousness, I just think the Democratic Party is in free fall. And the sheer panic in the eyes of James Carville is the perfect example of this. He's scared to death. It's the end of days. Wow. You want to talk about panic mode? This is beyond panic. I don't even know how to describe it. Let's read more. He said African-American voters are not interested in socialism and a revolution and all this foolishness you hear, but instead want to be sold on a vision for how they fit into this country. If we lose that, we're going to be the British Labour Party and be out in some theoretical left-wing la-la land, Carville said, adding that the country can't continue for another 4 years under Trump. Carville said he supports Senator Michael Bennet of Colorado for the nomination, hoping the long-shot candidate can come out of Tuesday's New Hampshire primary with a strong showing and bring his message to South Carolina. The Louisiana native also compared Sanders' passionate supporters to a cult, just like they do to Donald Trump. Sorry, I'm not interested in hearing it. I will certainly call it the woke identitarian left, which is a fringe faction of insane cultists. I'll call them cultists. No, I know a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters who are actually good, smart people who believe in Bernie's solutions to the problem. One thing I find interesting is how Bannon framed it. Steve Bannon said, Bernie Sanders has correctly identified the problem, but his solutions are wrong. It's particularly fascinating. I recommend The Hills Rising with Crystal Ball and Cigar and Jetty because you've got a conservative and a progressive being honest about what's happening and to a certain degree disagreeing on the ultimate solutions. When I looked at people like Crystal Ball, who is a Bernie supporter, I should say presumably, because I don't want to, throw labels around. I see an honest individual who does a good show and is willing to have a real conversation about what the solutions to our problems are. So no, I wouldn't call Bernie's broad base cultists because there are a lot of YouTube personalities that are not crazy identitarian leftists. The problem I do see, though, is Bernie is courting those people. And that to me is very, very disconcerting. But let's read on. He says, there's a certain part of the Democratic Party that wants us to be a cult. I'm not interested in being in a cult. I'm 75 years old. I'm just not a very culty person, he said. I love this tweet. This person said, breaking, old man yells at socialism. I love it. Carville had spoken out repeatedly in the past week following a disastrous first caucus in Iowa, where the party failed to release the results until a few days later. He went on to say that the Democratic Party was losing their minds, talking about open borders policy and giving healthcare to non-citizens. That's right. Carville identifies a lot of the same problems I do. But I've got bad news for you centrist establishment Democrat types, the resistance folks, whatever you may be, and good news for the Bernie Sanders folks. Now, this to me is very, very weird, but extremely important to bring up. You see, in the Real Clear Politics average, which is tracking polls of likely and registered voters, for some reason, right after the Iowa caucus, people stopped saying they would support Joe Biden. Now, I get it. A lot of people are motivated by who they think is going to win. But I must stress how strange it is that some of these polls go from before and after the Iowa caucus, and all of a sudden, Biden is tanking. I just find that really strange that Sanders is now the literal frontrunner in every respect. I predicted this. I said a while back, Biden's not really running, and there's no way he's the actual frontrunner. It's got to be Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, sure enough, won the popular vote. Is he going to win, the delegate count? We'll see. He didn't win the delegate count in Iowa, and New Hampshire is currently underway. We will see. But this is a question I have, a serious question. Why is it that just after the Iowa caucus, registered voters, who I got to be honest, many probably aren't paying attention, would all of a sudden stop supporting Biden? I think the answer is the polls are wrong. They've always been wrong. They realized they were wrong again and are, yes, changing the things. Well, maybe they're not changing. They would say if they were, like, oh, our methodology is changing. But I just find this very suspect, I got to admit. And it makes me question everything. So let me just tell you. The polls were wrong then. They're wrong now. No one in media has any idea what's going to happen, myself included. The best we can do is look at them and say, maybe they're right. I don't know. I have no idea. But none of this makes sense. And now we have this from 538. Bernie Sanders is the shoo-in to win with a 2 in 5 chance, 44%. That's their prediction. And again, strangely, Joe Biden was the predicted nominee, the potential nominee, and he drops right at the Iowa caucus. Why are they basing anything off these polls? Every single one. 538, you were wrong. You were all wrong. You have no idea what's going to happen. None of us do. And it's going to get messy. Now, as much as that's good news for the Bernie Sanders bunch, my congratulations to all of you for your coalition and your success. I'm now going to speak bluntly about how I think this is going to play out. I think James Carville is right, and I have only a couple examples to show you exactly why I think he is right. In this story from Sky News, damning new poll of real voters suggests reasons Corbyn lost the election. I'm going to stress this because some of you may not be aware, but it's very, very important. The left-wing party, it's called Labour in the UK, had one of the worst defeats in nearly 100 years. Could you imagine if, like, Chicago voted conservative? That would be mind-blowing. But there were certain areas that had been liberal, left-wing, blue, whatever, for 100 years, voted conservative. That was Jeremy Corbyn. And many people fear that his left-wing policies are very much in line with Bernie Sanders and the woke identitarian left, and that Bernie is going to be the American Corbyn. The subheader says, the poll suggests that the Labour leader was seen as weak, indecisive, and lacking in patriotism in December's election. You want to play that game? We'll play that game. How about this? Sanders apologizes to Biden for surrogates critique. The opinion piece by Zephyr Teachout accused Joe Biden of having a big corruption problem. Let's tackle that first accusation against Jeremy Corbyn. Weakness. Bernie Sanders had a surrogate send out an email accusing Biden of being corrupt. In fact, there were many people on the left, including socialists, straight up saying Joe Biden and his family are at least engaging in soft corruption. It had been written about for years. I said, thank you for calling it out. I don't care about Biden, and neither should any Bernie supporter. Biden is in the way of Bernie, and Biden is not really running as far as I'm concerned. But let's talk about weakness. After this email went out, and Bernie's supporters defended him, saying, no, it's true, Biden is corrupt. What did Bernie do? Bernie apologizes to Joe Biden. Grow a spine, man. Now, look. After the Iowa shenanigans, Bernie said he did not want a recanvass or a recount. That's what they call a recanvass. And I criticized him heavily for it. Again, weakness. But to be fair, he did turn around and say, no, I think we have to do this. So I will be fair in that regard. But I can also cite that moment when the activists took the stage away from Bernie. I'm sorry. Weakness is there with Bernie. And if you don't want to talk about the perception of his willpower, we can also talk about the fact, and again, I mean this with all due respect. I'm not trying to rag on Bernie for being old, but he really is a 78-year-old man who just had a heart attack. He will be seen as physically and mentally weak. With all due respect, okay? Because I understand a heart attack is a serious issue, and I'm not trying to drag him for an illness. I think it's unfortunate, and I really am disappointed that will play a substantial factor in whether or not his ideas are good. Look, I don't think a heart attack should get in the way of his ideas. I think he should be allowed to say them. And we need to challenge the ideas because ideas are intangible. They're bulletproof. They last forever. Blaming Bernie Sanders, blaming or saying the ideas are bad or saying he's going to be a bad president, which could affect the ideas he's presented simply because he's had a heart attack is unfortunate. But you know what? It's unfortunate that it will play that role. Sorry, Bernie is seen as weak. But I do think it's fair to argue his ideas. So there's a lot of people who will pick up the mantle for him, and we will continue that great battle of ideas. But let's go back and see what's the next bit. Indecisive. Okay. Is Bernie Sanders indecisive? Well, Joe Rogan said, you look back at Bernie's history and he's been fairly consistent. I used to think that way too. And then Bernie started saying things that confused me because I'm someone who pays attention to the news. And I started to realize that in the past several years, Bernie has been flip-flopping. He's not being consistent. He is being indecisive, which brings me to the next bit of evidence. You have not been consistent. Voter confronts Sanders on immigration flip-flop. This is from just last week. Bernie Sanders said in 2015 that open borders was a Koch brothers proposal. And now Bernie Sanders is on board with tons of open border style policy. I say open border style because I'm not suggesting Bernie literally wrote a bill saying abolish the borders. But he's talking about all these little tidbits like decriminalizing border crossings, illegal border crossings. He's talking about moratorium on deportations, bringing in substantially more refugees, increasing those numbers. It is very different to where he was before. Yes, Bernie Sanders is not the same candidate he was in 2015, and voters are calling him out. Now, potentially, there's some other issues in that regard. I think it's fair to say Bernie has been consistent on many issues. And he's been honest on many issues, but he's been fairly inconsistent on many others. I think it's fair to say that many will view him as indecisive. Which brings me now to the last accusation against Corbyn, lacking in patriotism. This I can't necessarily point the finger at to Bernie Sanders, aside from the things he's done in the past, like, honeymooning in the Soviet Union and praising some of these countries. I'll be fair. But the Democratic Party as a whole will reflect upon him, and there's nothing he can do about it. Now, I do think it's fair also to point out Bernie's an independent, but that's often used as a dig against him. Like James Carville himself said, Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat. He's independent. He's never been a Democrat. The people voting for him are not Democrats. Some are, most aren't. Fine. But to the average voter in this country, they will see the D next to his name, and it brings me to the last bit. Commentary from the morning call. Democrats look like they're running for president of Mexico because several Democratic candidates literally campaigned in Mexico. Now, that isn't necessarily Bernie's fault, but Bernie has supported a lot of the same policies pushed by the people who were campaigning in Mexico. So it all comes together. Jeremy Corbyn was weak, indecisive, and lacking in patriotism. And I think it's fair to say that the average American will look at Bernie in much the same way. Physical and mental weakness, flip-flopping on core issues like immigration, and being party to various policies that would weaken America. Bernie Sanders was very different in 2015. He opposed TPP. He talked about the problems of NAFTA, defended the working class, and said no open borders. In fact, people compared him to Donald Trump. The difference was his populist, a welfare message, Medicare for all, college, etc. Trump had more of a right-wing approach, but they both identified what many feel was the right problem. That's what Steve Bannon said. So I think, based on what I've just shown, Bernie Sanders is the likely shoo-in for the nomination. We'll see how voter turnout, happens in New Hampshire, but it's already looking bad. And then Bernie Sanders will be resoundingly defeated by Donald Trump in the general election. Many people are betting on igniting new voters. I have seen it from the progressives. Bernie's goal is to get people who have never voted before to vote. And it's fair to say Donald Trump did just that. I spoke with so many voters back in 2016 who said they had never voted before this, but Trump was their guy. He brought in an insurgency into the Republican Party. Here's the bad news. The turnout for the primary is at 2016 levels. So even if you have brought in those new voters, you haven't nudged the needle at all. This is where the media starts getting funny. First, we saw this. From February 4th, the most important Iowa result is in. Democrats should worry. And this was about voter turnout because voter turnout was really bad. Which brings me to today, where nothing makes sense, but hey, let's sit around and see what happens because the Washington Post writes, time for Democrats to panic? They'll get a sense tonight. Turnout in Iowa was disappointing. It should be better in New Hampshire. The question is, how much? And in the same day, Washington Post, with seemingly no editorial oversight, writes this piece. Calm down. Democrats are not in disarray. Okay, calm down, panic. What do you want me to do, Washington Post? Should I worry about the turnout? Should I begin to panic as we wait for the numbers? Or should I calm down because everything is A-OK? I don't know, Washington Post, but I think you need some better editorial oversight. So the turnout in 2016 was actually interesting. And this is important to highlight because Republican voter turnout in the primaries was 17.3 million, according to Pew, and 11.7 million, according to the same stats, which means although we're looking at Trump losing the popular vote, it seems like he had the enthusiasm. I don't know if any of these Democrats are going to have that level of enthusiasm. The Republican Party united around Trump because they wanted to win, and they did. And today they are united around Trump. As much as many people like to refute Trump's claims that he's got a ridiculous support from the Republican Party, around 95%, the reality is it is around 90 or so percent in the aggregate. Many polls showing it's like high 80s to low 90s. The Republicans have rallied around him. That Walsh guy, whatever he was doing, tried to run against Trump, and he got booed and jeered, and people cheered for Trump. The Democrats don't have any of that. Pete Buttigieg was booed in New Hampshire. So what do you think comes next? Bernie Sanders, the insurgent candidate, is going to win the nomination. And right now, it seems like they're kind of holding the Democrats hostage. Here's an example on Twitter. Tom Nichols, who is one of these, my understanding is like one of these never Trumper guys, said someone tried to report me for a violation of Twitter TOS because I'm tweeting what I think Bernie Sanders will do if he's not the nominee. Congratulations, Bernie cultists. You're moving into MAGA troll territory. Bernie Sanders supporters are saying, if you don't vote for Bernie, we won't support your candidate. The biggest blank or bust is Yang or bust, but Bernie or bust played a substantial role in Trump winning in 2016. I have seen the posts, I have seen the articles and the commentary from the high-profile personalities saying straight up, if you want to win, you better support Bernie because only 53% of his base have committed to actually voting Democrat if he doesn't win. It's us or you lose. For many Democrats, they're saying, they might vote for whoever. Vote blue no matter who, they say. Elizabeth Warren has the biggest vote blue no matter who faction. I don't think Bernie's going to pull it off. I don't. I think he'll win the nomination. He won't pull off the general. But hey, I've been wrong in the past. And hubris is the downfall of any contender. Hillary Clinton thought she couldn't lose. The media laughed all the way to the polls. And then Trump came in and swept everything up. If you think it's going to be easy for Trump, you are sorely mistaken. While I can certainly sit here and say all signs point to a major Trump victory, I was wrong about what was going to happen in 2018. I thought because of all the woke outrage and insanity that moderate voters in this country would wake up and be like, I can't stand this. Quite the contrary. They flipped like 40 seats in the House and took control and then impeached Donald Trump. They could still pull a comeback. The polls are wrong. Trump supporters, if you get lulled into a false sense of security, especially around Bernie Sanders, you will be defeated. And the important thing to recognize is as much as I'm not a fan of Bernie Sanders, not as much as I used to be especially, I think it's important to know that he has a large faction of supporters who are not stupid. They know exactly what they want from Bernie. They know why they want it, and they have good reason to support him. You might disagree with his solutions. I know I certainly do. But if you underestimate your opponent, you will lose the same as Hillary Clinton did. So don't be surprised if you see a 2020 Bernie Sanders general victory because Trump felt like he was invincible. I don't know what's going to happen. I do think Trump is going to win for a lot of reasons, and I think he's going to win really, really well. But I could be wrong. I could be wrong again. I could be wrong about a lot of things. Don't, look, if you're one of those people who wants to criticize me, stop acting like I think I'm smarter than anyone else, because I don't. I just read the news every day, and then I say what I think is going to happen. The truth is I've been right about a lot of things. There are certain things that I've been able to call out and say, hey, I think this is going to happen. And they've happened. I won't get super specific because, I don't want to drag other people into this political debacle, but I've mentioned some things and they've happened. And I've mentioned some things and they've not happened. Why? Because I'm not a prophet. I'm a regular person just saying what I think is going to happen. I think Trump is going to win. But again, watch that hubris. Stick around. The next segment's coming up at 6 p.m. youtube.com/TimCastNews. It is a different channel, and I will see you all there.